And welcome back to Pastor Plek's podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Plek, with my really sweet wife here, Adrienne Plek. We've now been married for 13 years.
Yep.
And also in studio with us is none other than Machine Gun Nick. Welcome, Machine Gun Nick.
I had a 13-year marriage. It ended.
Way to make it 13 years, though. It's pretty good.
It is pretty good.
I'm proud of it.
3 of those were in separation.
Oh, all right. Okay, so we're talking about the message from this past Sunday where we looked at Luke 22 and we started at verse 35 all the way to verse 53. And Pastor Mo, none other than Muhammad Ali, brought the word, and it was a fantastic word. What was your initial thoughts on that sermon, Adrienne?
Well, I enjoyed the sermon. Felt like Mo, kind of came into himself a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
People don't know that Mo's pretty funny.
So, yeah, so you think that this was like his, I'm a funny person moment?
I think it was like my true colors I'm going to start showing him.
Okay, yeah, I've built enough rapport with
Yeah.
enough trust. The funny is coming out.
Yeah, and he's taking some risks with his jokes. I like that.
Mhm. What was the risk he took?
Well, he made a Second Amendment joke that was pretty good.
That was funny. Yeah, that was funny.
And he talked about the male affection in a way that was a little bit enjoyable.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about what the big emphasis that he put on was what will you do with God's Son? And initially, the sermon was sort of broken down to 3 different parts. There's part 1 where Jesus is telling the disciples there's going to be a change of mission, a frago, if you will. Machine Gun Nick, how'd you feel about this frago?
Well, so it was kind of confusing because we get this hey, don't travel with your bag or
Money
or a sword, and then Jesus is like, hey, trade in your cloak for a sword. So the machine gun part of me is like, yeah, here we go. and then we go and get the swords, right? And then Jesus is like, wait a minute, but don't use them. Of course, they're in the process of using them, and they're like, hey, Jesus, is this okay? Whack! And we find out Peter's a horrible swordsman, misses the head completely, but takes an ear off a soldier.
Right.
And then Jesus goes and puts it back on, and we're kind of, I'm even here but you said get the swords.
Right.
Right? That Second Amendment part, hey, you want me to arm up, we're going to go do this. And we've already gone over this. Plek, if you don't tell me no, people, people are going to get hurt.
Yeah, we mentioned that's why you have officers in the military, because if you kill off the officer in other armies, then everyone just waits they go defensive posture until an officer shows up. Whereas with the American Army, that's where they just start killing everything.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
He's gone. And there's a really horrible feeling inside, but the rest of me is like, and now we commence.
Right.
They're all going to die.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about Jesus' change of mission. He says to them, essentially, before, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? And they're like, nothing. And he says, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, likewise a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled. He was numbered with the transgressors, for what is written about me has its fulfillment. And you say, hey, here, Jesus, we got 2 swords, and that's enough. Now, what I just thought was, to your point, the very next thing that happens, they pray on the Mount of Olives, and then Judas comes, betrays Jesus, and when those around them saw what would follow, meaning the band of merry men and swords, Lord, shall we strike with a sword? And then one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. So, literally what you just said. Hey, make sure you have swords. We got 2 swords. Oh, that's great. Man, that's what we needed. And then he goes and whacks off somebody. Should I be doing this? And I think that is confusing. Now, when I read about the sword, Jesus specifically says they must be numbered with the transgressors. So I think this had to do with you can't be an unarmed transgressor. I think it just looks bad in the transgressor world. You got to have somebody, whenever you arrest somebody, do they have any guns? No, they're on private. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is to make it have an appearance of some sort of righteousness for the sake of him being numbered with the transgressors. I don't know. I think some people can take this as, that was not for people to defend themselves because Jesus wanted to be numbered with the transgressors, and that was fulfill Scripture for him, but so that doesn't necessarily apply to us. Anyway, there's a lot that you can go into that. Personally, I think you are allowed to defend yourself. However, the mindset you have is that ultimately it's not about fighting, it's about winning people for Jesus, which, any thoughts on that from you guys?
No.
Did you just get lost on that one?
No, I got it. So he didn't tell them to get a sword because it was about the fight.
Right. Tell them to get a sword for the appearance of being transgressors.
Do you think that's true?
I mean, that's what it says. I mean,
So we get the sword so that when they come for us, they have more to put against us. They have a reason to actually arrest us.
right. And so, but is it necessarily, and this is where it gets challenging, is the sword for the next meeting with Judas? And he said to them, when I sent you out with no money bag, knapsack, or sandals, did you lack anything? They said nothing. He said to them, but now, so he's going on a missional statement. But now let the one who has a money bag take it, likewise a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that Scripture must be fulfilled, and he was numbered with the transgressors. So the only time he's ever going to be traveling ever again in the history of his life is in this next moment of going to the Mount of Olives.
Right.
So Mo makes it sound like the sword was like not a sword. It was the word of God. But we don't believe that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, they didn't have like 2 words of God hanging around.
Well, do you remember the sermon?
Yeah, I think he's meaning, so in a literal sense, he literally means swords. Maybe in the future sense,
He means
he
word
could
of God.
mean word of God, which is the sword of the Spirit. Maybe.
But he means real swords, right?
But
I mean, right here he's talking about real swords because you wouldn't carry a Bible around to be numbered with the transgressors.
right.
right. On the flip side of this, are they going to need swords in the future? Because they do all die like horrible deaths, right?
Yeah, except for John, he just gets exiled. And whenever they die, they willingly submit. They take the civil disobedience route to its death. And
Except, do we really think God would have them get a sword just to look like a part? I don't think so.
well, yeah. I mean,
If it serves the prophecy, then yes.
yeah, I totally.
There you go.
I do think that's what is serving the prophecy. I do think that's what is challenging about this is where in the where are they when they take the move to the Mount of Olives? They've got it's not like they didn't. They always had the swords, right? It's not like they had to go sell a cloak and buy swords. They had swords with them the whole time. And they were just like, hey, Jesus, 2 swords good, or do we need more? And Jesus like, that's enough. So it's not like they didn't have swords before. I think that's the thing that's...
Okay.
It's not like they were like, oh, crud, we need to find a sword around here. No, they had swords. And so they take them with them as they had probably been doing before. But he was talking about in the intentional missionary movement, make sure that you go armed. The problem with it is Jesus has to be numbered with the transgressors.
So maybe it's prophecy, maybe it's preparation, or
I think that's where it could be both things.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, I think that's something that it's worth debating over, but it's a weird connection here. We can come back to that in a bit. All right, what about this next part though? I think is fascinating for me. Is what about when Jesus goes to the garden, right? He's praying. He's got the disciples with him. He drops off 9 of the disciples, 8 of the disciples. And then he takes the next 3 with him to go to stay close to him, Peter, James, and John. And then they start praying. He's in absolute agony. It's in the wee hours of the night. They don't really know what's going on. They're falling asleep. Jesus is like, hey, wake up. Don't fall into temptation. And then he goes a stone's throw and he says, Lord, if you're willing, let this cup pass from me. And then he is then strengthened by an angel of some sort. So when you guys read that, to me, this might be the most impactful part of the entire Bible. Would you agree with that?
I think it's up there, yeah.
Yeah. So, and here's why. He's saying, I don't want to drink the wrath of God. I want to not. If there's another way. So how do you guys? That to me is just wild. How do you handle that? I want another way.
Well, I see it as perhaps the most humanistic view of Jesus right there. Like here, like because we see him as the Son of God, and he can make all these miracles happen, and he'd go 40 days in the desert with temptation and not take it. And so he's like this like, I mean, that is awesome. Like I don't know if I could do any of that. Well, obviously I can't, right? But then we see him. Now here's this final step, and it's going to be like the hardest, and he's actually going to feel all the pain and all the suffering, and he's going to have to go through all of that, and he's like, but God, do I really have to do that? And that to me is like the most, it makes him human. Like at this point in time, he is not just the Son of God, he's also a human.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
You see it.
Right. I mean, he's 100% man, 100% God at all times.
Right.
And when he goes to the cross, what he's asking is Father, if there's another way. If we can do Islam, if Muhammad is the way, then let's do it that way. If the 5 pillars, or if like we can get karma to work out, or if there's some enlightened sort of state, if there's any other way, let's do it that way, and not by me having to take on the wrath of God that I've been, as Jesus would say, he has been dishing out the wrath of God. Now he's going to be on the receiving end of it. And it's so terrifying that, I mean, we see Jesus in all sorts of situations. Like everybody wants to kill him, he walks through the crowd. When somebody is dead, he raises them from the dead. Like there's nothing that should freak him out, but here he is sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, begging the disciples to pray with him, and they can't because they're so tired. It's because I don't think anybody can possibly fathom what it meant to look the wrath of God full on.
Yeah.
And so I think
Agreed.
Whenever I was in the Army, when I was 22, 23, I had another lieutenant. He was like 10 years older than me, and he was a former SF guy that had become an officer. And we would hang out, and he would always have like Christian tapes on and stuff, and whenever we would talk, he would just kind of repeat this. If there was any other way, it was like on repeat in my head. Then he would do it that way. But there wasn't. That's why the Garden of Gethsemane is so important. There is no other way. I just can hear Sam. That was his name. Sam Cohn was just in my head all the time about there was no other way. If there was any other way for anyone to be saved, it would have been done because Jesus asked for it. And that's why if you are a Christian, and I think this becomes important, if you're a Christian and you claim that there is another way other than Jesus, like maybe, I don't know, this is where... I don't know why if you're a Christian, if you would ever do this, but let's just say you're claiming to be a Christian and you're like, well, people who have never heard could go to heaven because, God will have mercy on them. Then why wouldn't Jesus say, like, then don't tell anybody I'm doing this? Because the moment someone hears about it, then they are now somehow on the hook, guilty of rejecting the Son of God. Whereas if they could be just completely ignorant, that would be a blessing to them. And so what I think the reality is, whether you are you have no knowledge of who Jesus is because you haven't heard of a Jesus yet, or whether you've been been to church a zillion times and just reject him outright, the wrath of God is coming like gravity is coming, like the way fire burns. I think this is where we want to view God. We over-personalize God and don't understand the holiness of God. And so therefore, Jesus has to die and then impute his righteousness to us, and he imputes our sin to him. I think that becomes so important, which I feel like that's a part of this that I don't ever want to I want to overdo, because I think it's that important to communicate there is no other way other than to put your full faith and trust in what Jesus has done for us on the cross. All right, did I land the plane on that?
Yeah. I do like it. I think that it is, I think it shows how I think it's easy to look at the crucifixion and focus on the crucifixion and as the like climax of the
Right.
punishment, and it just wasn't that.
Right. The climax is right here in the garden.
Well, or maybe I would say the climax is hell.
Sure. Okay, that would be the hell. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is on the cross then.
Oh, he experiences hell while he's on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
Not until he dies, right?
No. My God, why have you forsaken
Oh, so
me?
he's experiencing hell alive?
Uh-huh.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I thought that's what happened when he was in the tomb.
No. So remember because now this is where we're getting to the part that you don't know about is from his death at Friday at 3:00 ish to Easter or Resurrection Sunday. You don't know where he went. You just know that he descended into hell.
Right. I always assumed that after his death he descended into hell, but you know what? Who cares? It doesn't really matter. The fact is he
But I
experienced
think
hell.
I think experiencing hell on the cross is completely fine. And
But it wasn't the cross. Like I think the focus is often on it's the nails, it was the suffocation.
right,
and it's like
it's
that.
a physical expression of the pain.
Right, but the physical was not
Right.
the worst part.
Because way more people have died in way worse ways.
Right, and I think I always grew up believing that was the most extreme, horrible form, and then you would discover other ways that were debatably as awful or worse, and that just isn't the focus. Isn't that the focus? Is that he was separated from his communion with God,
Right.
And that is the worst part. And
That's
that
the
is
worst
the
part.
and I think when I started to understand that, I started to understand the gravity of my sin in that it separates me, it like distances me from God, and that's actually worse than the consequences that I experienced, the earthly consequences of
Oh
my
wow!
sin.
I think let's go into that because I think what you just said was really powerful. So, the consequence of our sin isn't just a painful experience on a cross, a physical painful experience. Because I think that's what you're relating, or a physical painful experience on earth.
Right. It's just, it's actually, because I think a lot of the time when I would like consider, okay, well, I know this is probably sin, or I know for sure it's sin, but like maybe I'm going to engage it anyway, it's kind of worth it. Like, I'm like, okay, like, what's it going to be? Like, I'm going to, whatever
like
the sin would be, it was like, I'm kind of like, I'm braced for the consequence of this one. Like, I know
Right.
it's going to hurt. I might regret it. I might not. But like, you can kind of calculate. Sometimes you can calculate consequences of decisions and kind of consider that maybe they're worth this momentary pleasure or this laziness or whatever it is that you're going to choose to engage. But the reality is the more painful consequence of that sin is the distance that it puts in your unity and your relationship with God. And that's what creates the depression. That's what creates the discouragement. That's what creates the hopelessness. That's what creates the void that only Christ can fill is made bigger and made more empty when we choose to sin and separate ourselves further from our connection with him. And so
Right.
when you consider that the worst punishment on the cross wasn't all of the agony that was physical, but it was instead the broken unity, well, it helps you recognize that like in our life today, that broken unity actually hurts us more
Right.
than it just does. And you might not think that it does, but it is hurting you worse than the consequence of, like, you can screw up your marriage and live the rest of your life in pain because you've messed up your marriage, but that's actually not as bad as the lack of repentance of what would happen if you continue to allow that distance between you and God the rest of your life.
Right. That'd be way worse.
Way worse.
And also it might show you that you actually don't have a relationship with God if you have no fruit in your life, or if you're allowing that to go on, like whatever.
Well, and also it's hopeful. Like in the example of a marriage, it's like if you were to choose to wreck your marriage and then experience the consequence of that, there is a hope and redemption. Not because the marriage is necessarily going to come back together,
Right.
but because your unity with God can be restored and
Right.
you can heal, even though you're still experiencing some of the consequences.
That's
of
great.
that
That's
choice.
why the cross becomes so important, is because what Jesus does on the cross is he makes a way at any moment for you to be completely forgiven for all your sin and to have a restorative relationship with him. You can't lose your salvation, obviously, but what we're talking about here is like there's this part where if you recognize what Jesus has done for you and then you're walking in sin, it's going to pull you back like a beacon drawing you, saying like, get right with him. And when you don't, you feel the weight of that, which is brutal. And then sometimes God even gives you over to your sin for a season, and you're like, yeah, whatever. And you're only making your life worse spiritually, emotionally, physically, all the things.
Right, exactly. And I think it's just important to remember that the consequences that you're bringing upon yourself are not the worst part.
Yeah,
It's the
Machine Gun Nick, does
spiritual.
that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does actually.
How so?
The biggest, I think, thing in my life that resonates with is the two marriages. The first one where I wasn't a very good husband, and then the second one where I had to endure what having not a very good partner feels like.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like, oh my gosh, you know. And it never feels fair, right? When
Right.
you're going through it, and you're like, what? And there was at some point where I was like, I resigned to be like, well, I kind of deserve this, you know.
Yeah.
You know, like maybe this is it's a time, a season, and it will get better. And then when it never did, I'm like, okay, I got to get out of this,
Right.
you know. But that kind of makes me think of that. Like I did X, Y, and Z, which was not right, and then I go run off with somebody else, and like not even fully divorced yet, just take off with another girl, and go through X, Y, and Z. And you're just kind of like, huh.
That didn't work out.
Yeah, that did not work out. That was what we call in the Army piss poor planning,
Yeah.
right?
So, yeah. And so that kind of brought you to a place of rock bottom, I would say, right?
Well, yeah, you met me at the end,
And then that's when
that
Christ met you.
That's exactly where like it was like something's got to change because like we talked about the white knuckling. You say it a lot, and I've probably repeated it a lot, where you're just like, I got to make it through this.
Yeah.
This will end like, or this too shall pass. That whole cliche.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, I gotta go. I can muscle through this like everything else in life. And you go on through that, and I think what is probably a good 30 years, 40 years of that ish. And then like I'm looking at it like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, I like what you said about like just sort of feeling like whenever you go through hard times, oh, I deserve this. Adrian, have you ever experienced, is that a thing that you've kind of had to overcome?
And that's like probably the Catholic in me coming out.
Because what we deserve is hell, right? But I think sometimes we think it's our good decisions or bad decisions. There are consequences of our sin, right? There's consequences of our sin. There's consequences of our righteousness. Consequence of righteousness is blessing. The consequence of sin is sort of pain. But sometimes you experience grace and in a physical like life way where you don't necessarily have to be Job. Like you don't have to have like the whole world fall on you. And he was one of the most righteous guys ever. And he has a whole bunch of bad stuff that he didn't deserve, in a sense, happen to him. And so I think that it can mess with you when we kind of take a karma mindset to God, because he does what he wants and he is a father. And so sometimes we can think of like, if it were me and I know I'm a great dad and so therefore I would do this for my kid. Well, we can't think like that because then that puts us in the place of God. What we need to do as a child, because sometimes when you're disciplining your child, they don't know they're going to get the present at the end. They just know that they're sad right now because they have to go to their room or whatever the thing is. And for them, that's like an eternity. And I think that's hard for us to sort of wrap our head around as a child of God, to kind of look up at him and trust him with whatever the thing is, whether it's we deserved it or whether we didn't, of just walking in grace, of knowing I have a relationship with my Father and I trust him. I think that becomes the biggest part of that. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I do feel like, well, so here's my thinking with the whole, for some reason, the deserved thing has always been like kind of a, I've always
Trigger?
had a like, yeah, I hate the word trigger, but like a trigger reaction.
Yeah.
Because I think that I was early in my upbringing, I was raised in a pretty like legalistic environment where there was this idea that different sins maybe had different punishments, and that, you know, if you choose unwisely how to live, well, then there might be this discipline. And here's the thing, and it wasn't all bad teaching, it wasn't all bad thinking, But there's some key parts of it that I've learned to just really hold on to, because anytime someone talks about deserving, like, you deserve hell. Okay.
Right.
That's what you deserve. And so when someone's like, I don't deserve this, I'm like, you're right. You don't. You deserve hell is what you deserve. And so I think it's really important to believe that and to focus your mind on that, because anything else, like, it doesn't matter how bad your current circumstance is.
Right.
If you're sitting there feeling like, man, I kind of deserved this. Well, no, actually, you deserved much worse than this.
Right.
And I think anything else other than hell is elevating yourself, and it's elevating your efforts from a place of pride, whether you feel it as pride or not. It's ultimately you've elevated yourself. And so to me, like, I think it's very important to change the mentality of like, okay, I made a lot of decisions and I'm living in the consequence. Like, I've made my bed and now I'm having to lie in it. Okay. I think that's kind of a healthy mental recognition. I chose, like, whether it was who I chose to marry, whether it was who, like, there's been several times, like, I had some dark years, like, when my kids were young and they weren't sleeping, and I was like, okay, I chose to have these kids. Granted, the Lord, like, there is no conception outside of him. I understand that. But there was some decision that we'd made in, like, trying for children. And I'm like, this is the consequence of my decision. Like, I made a decision to, like, never have a reprieve, to never have a break, and to keep pushing hard when we didn't really have a great balance going, and we just kept adding more kids. And, like, part of me is experiencing the consequence of my choice. And I think it's important to consider that, but then it's also important to consider that God is a good father, that he does love us, that his desire is to meet us where we are and to provide that rest and to provide that comfort and that hope regardless of what the circumstance is. And so in the case of, like, maybe in your second marriage that you were just describing, it's like God still is a God of hope and redemption, even in that bad scenario that is probably the result of some poor decision making,
Right.
but not that you deserved, because what you deserved was actually much worse. And I think it's just so important to keep that in line. And I often, with my girlfriends, like, we've learned to joke about it, because jokes seem to be kind of a quick way to, like, reframe your mindset in a way that doesn't come off so rude. But
Is this how you help lovingly correct somebody?
yeah, and I think we kind of all do it with each other. But there's this mentality that we have a lot of times as moms that, like, if we believe that we've screwed our kid up, on the other side of that coin, when they do something positive, we also are crediting ourselves for that too.
Right.
And so when one of my friends was, like, going off one day about how I made this horrible decision and this horrible decision, and it's because of these decisions that they're this way and that all these, and I'm like, And she's probably right in that she's experiencing some consequences of her choices. But at the end of the day, God was sovereign over her choices. God was sovereign over this child's life. God is sovereign over what happens in the future with this child. And so we, like, stop giving yourself so much credit.
Right.
Because in the same heart that you're giving yourself all this, like, condemnation and criticism for your bad decisions, that also probably means that deep down inside, you're giving yourself a whole lot of kudos for the things that are kind of going well in them. And that's scary. And so one of the friends,
I guess on the flip side of that too, because I feel like, because people could go the other way, like they start talking about all the things they've done to make their kid awesome.
Right. But if a friend is talking about how they've ruined their kid,
Yeah.
whether they're saying it out loud or not, they're crediting probably mentally how they've also made their
Sure,
kid how they
sure.
are.
Right.
And so it's very important, I think, to stop the negative, because you're like, hey, hang on, like, you're giving yourself
That might
too
be
much
the
credit.
that might be the best way to correct somebody overly on the top on the positive, is by correcting their negative thinking.
Correct.
Because that's a way to easily, like, you're actually not that great of a parent. God's grace was all over your life. That's
Right.
probably rude. But when you're saying you're actually not that bad of a parent, this is God's in complete control of all
Like, you're
that.
giving yourself too much credit is always kind of what we say. And or we say, like, oh, you're the linchpin of your family, or oh, it's all up to you. And it kind of helps you remember, like, oh, that's not true. But it
Right.
sure feels true in the moment.
Does that resonate for you? Like, do you feel like parenting for a second?
Not right now, because I'm not really in their lives, so I don't see.
Like, you don't feel the weight of that?
No, I feel the weight of that. I don't feel any weight of anything good that I've contributed at this time.
Right.
Because it's been so long, you know? And
Right. So
like,
all the, I guess, like the lack of relationship you have with your children?
Right.
Is there a part of that like, oh, I deserve that? This is punishment for me.
No, I don't deserve that. No. That's something between has a little bit to do with the relationship with the ex and some other things, but no, I don't believe I deserve that at all.
Okay, so yeah, okay. So
I mean,
you're not hard on yourself about that
It'd be
stuff.
different if I thought I was an alcoholic,
Right.
or I was endangering their lives when they're with me, or any of the other crap that's accused of me.
Right.
But I'm not a druggie. I'm not an alcoholic. Like, I don't, like they don't. Well, I don't go and get in car wrecks with them in the car or anything. Like,
Okay.
But so I'm kind of like a little miffed that it is the way it is, because I'm like over here like I'm not all these bad things. I'm not a felon. I'm not.
Sure.
There's no reason why my kids should be held from me.
Yeah.
But they are, and so that's an injustice, and it's not what God would like. That's not what He would ultimately desire.
Right.
But He's
Right.
still sovereign within that, and so. But it makes sense to say you're not crediting yourself either way right now. There's this absence where you're probably your only hope is like how God's gonna.
Yeah, but I do think there's God's sovereignty and human responsibility that are like in tension. And so in any circumstance and situation, to your point, you don't want to overly take credit for stuff, but also to your point, you made some choices that
Right.
ultimately led you here. And so you have the human responsibility and God's sovereignty should be constantly in tension, which means God, because he's connected to your human responsibility, he can override or use it in however he sees fit. That's why Romans 8:28, all things work for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So even in your situation of a divorce, of not having the relationship you'd like to have your kids, somehow all things, that includes that thing, works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So I don't know how that's going to work out for good. But it will do two things. One, it'll be for God's glory and your good ultimately. And it might even be like, I don't have a relationship with my kids like I want. I want to lean into the Lord. I want to lean into that relationship. So the recognition of that could cause you to go into. I'm not sure how God ultimately is going to work it out, but I think that one thing that is super important is to see that the tension between the God's sovereignty and our human responsibility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, if you've got questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can text us at 737-231-0605 or go to pastorplek.com. Would love to hear from you. Text in your questions. Just leave a voicemail, whatever you want to do. We'd love to hear from you. We're here to talk about faith, culture, and everything in between. Any other final thoughts before we move on? Oh, I do want to go on one more thing.
Okay.
Because I was going to talk about, is it right to because I kind of where we were going with the question earlier, like, is it actually right to carry? And I think that would be something to look at, like carry a weapon. And what we saw in that story was Jesus saying, "Hey, make sure you carry a weapon, so that you can be seen as, so I can be seen as a transgressor." Does that mean he didn't actually want you to carry weapons, or does that mean you should carry weapons? What is it? And there is no, that verse doesn't give you an answer, honestly.
No, it doesn't.
And there isn't another answer. Like, remember whenever John the Baptist comes up to soldiers, he doesn't say, "Hey, lay down your weapons." John the Baptist is baptizing people for the repentance, for the forgiveness of sins. And these soldiers come up and say, "Hey, what must we do?" And they're like, "Hey, don't extort people, and don't make any false threats or accusations, and be content with your wages." In other words, do your job. Do your job well, execute justice. Romans 13 says that you should obey the laws of the king. He doesn't bear the sword for nothing. So that's what I always would talk about whenever I was a soldier. Like, I am under the authority of a governmental body, and so therefore any killing I'm doing in this circumstance is just in the eyes of God, because unless it's like immoral, like you're killing kids or something. But I'm doing it as an outworking of his arm, because he's in charge of that. And then Psalm 144:1 is where David says, he praised God who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle, because pull the bow and arrow. I think that there's a part there that there's a honor, and it's godly to be trained for war, to be ready for battle. Because when it comes to solving injustice, I don't necessarily think we should be involved in vigilante justice. But if it comes to defending your wife and children, I think that's a righteous thing to do.
Well, that is said in Scripture that a man is the protector and the provider.
Right.
And providing, I feel, is another form of protection, because if you don't provide for your family, then guess what? It's not going to be there.
Yeah, and you're worse than an unbeliever.
That's right.
That's the Scripture.
That's right. So on that note, I think carrying is your right or your duty.
Yeah, but you could also say, I mean, this is where it just depends, right? So does that mean that people who are not carrying, they're not doing, like that's where you go that direction. So I don't want to go that far. So, but I do think it's an honorable thing to carry, but I also think it's a very honorable thing not to. So I would say, like, when a person they're called to be a peacemaker, right? And so if you're, now granted, there's weapons called the peacemaker, which is kind of convenient. But like when you're as a peacemaker, your entire mindset shouldn't be, shoot first, ask questions later, or here's my deterrent. This will make sure that they understand their place. It's going to be like, I want to provide like a solution that puts that person to understand justice or understand righteousness or whatever. And that doesn't necessarily require a weapon. But I do think it's important that you follow the law on the one hand. And so I think this is a debatable matter that, should Christians carry? I think you can be a Christian and say, like, all Christians should carry. I think that's an okay thing to say. But I think it's also okay to say nobody should carry. I think that's a Christian thing to say as well.
I don't know about that.
I don't know about that.
I love you guys. You guys are texting.
I'm going to go with maybe you should do what you can.
Yeah. So here's my thing. I don't carry. I have girlfriends that do.
Yeah.
And I wish I could be like them.
Well, why don't you?
But I don't carry because I don't have the ability to be as responsible as necessary to be carrying. I just don't. I won't remember it. It'll be in like a bag. It'll be in a classroom. I'll walk through the elementary. Like, there's too many places I will go that I like. And I don't trust myself to have discernment in the moment of when to pull it out, when to engage it, when to use it. And so right now, I scream like I'm going to die when Cody comes up the stairs every single day to my office. I'm scared. I'm caught off guard. When Chris walks into our bathroom every single day, I scream really loud.
Like,
so I don't know what that's about. I wish it wasn't that way. I don't know why. And so I don't trust my
sorry.
Like, what am I going to do? Like, I feel my heart races and I scream. And sometimes if I'm really scared, I'll fall to the ground. Like, so you don't want somebody like that with a gun on them. You just don't. Because what am I going to do? I might pull it out when it's not needed yet, when it's premature. And then the odds of me being overpowered, it being used on me, it being now I'm sourcing a weapon to a criminal. To me, those are all things that are likely to happen with my personality, with my whatever. So, but I am so thankful for the friends that I have that are like disciplined enough and mature enough and controlled enough to like take the responsibility of responsibly, legally carrying a weapon. I'm so thankful for them because to me, they're doing me a favor by taking on that responsibility seriously. And it's not convenient. Like it's uncomfortable. It's like inconvenient to be carrying around a firearm, but they do it, and I view that as like a civil service. I really do, and so I'm thankful. So like I have certain friends where I'm like really grateful if they're coming with me to something because I'm like, okay, we're kind of safe. Like I get to ride on the fact that they're prepared in the event that something was going to happen. So I'm grateful for those people, but I would never say we shouldn't, but I would also never say, oh, we all should, because I'm like, well, shoot, like I shouldn't. I'm quite confident of that. And so I think that I really do believe that me carrying at this stage in my life would do more harm than good. And so I'm like, and not because I I can't shoot a gun, right? I can shoot a target pretty well if I don't say so. If I might say so myself, but I don't. But in the moment of a need for that, I don't trust myself. I don't feel confident. And so to me, it's a choice, and it's that you have to discern. But do I think that that like mass shootings are happening because we have a constitutional carry? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think mass shootings are the result of 100 things before they're the result of gun sales. And even at the point of gun sales, I don't think you can point them to.
So this comes to the question: what do you do if the government tells you to turn in all your weapons?
So I have a big problem with that, and I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I probably would.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
Yeah, if the government said turn in your weapons, I would follow the Romans 13.
I'm not turning in my weapons. I'm not even. We're not even gonna. Forgive me, God, Jesus, everybody. I'm not. No.
But see, I think you could justify it as not sinful. Like
How?
I think you could, depending on how it went down.
Yeah, it'd be
I
tough.
mean, we did this during COVID. We wrote a note.
There's probably gonna be some sinning.
But I mean, during COVID, the Texas government said masks are not required. And the school board said masks are required. So I'm like, okay. So I wrote a note saying, hey, we are training our sons to follow the government authority. The governing authority has said this is an optional choice, and we are not forcing them and we are not training them to follow unsubordinate authority, which is what the school board was.
Right.
So
I
I
agree
wrote
with
that,
that,
and
100%.
and my kids didn't wear masks all of
They're the
COVID.
only kids not wearing masks.
And we're the only kids.
That's incredible.
They were some of the few.
No, they were like, I think we were the only ones.
But,
it was
but I was
totally
like, there's
weird,
no
but it was
way.
great.
I'm not training you that we're submitting to insubordinate authority. However, if the Texas governing, when the Texas government required them, I withdrew them from school, and we took care of education on our own.
Right.
And so there is a point where I think it's important to but this is where I'm like, is it going to be, if the U.S. president says, like, give up your
It would have
weapons,
to
but then
be
the
like a
Texas
law.
governor says not to? If there's a loophole to get around it, you believe we're getting around it.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think I don't think we're gonna have to deal with that in the next 20 years, God willing. But it is something that's the question that people always are asking: is what do you do?
And I think you have to consider that you need to be very responsible and prepared, just like he's saying with these swords.
And maybe
so what
you
does
go
that mean?
find
Does
a
that mean you
plot
go
of property and bury them there
I was
and
about to
wait?
say, do you bury them? Do you say I'm relinquishing them, and do you somehow find a
I
loophole?
have no,
for what?
I have no ownership of these.
Because they're
on
in
my-
the
They
They
ground.
got lost
property.
in a boating accident.
Yeah.
Or do you go to Mexico and
Or do you go to
find a
Mexico or
place for
Costa
them?
Rica?
Yeah. And maybe you keep them. I mean, I just think that there are ways around to be submissive to the law,
Yep.
and not sinful, but also not necessarily comply in the way that is maybe being.
Or you could do civil disobedience.
Civil disobedience, I think at times was very scriptural.
Mm-hmm.
So
It's just the problem is it has
it's
to be
not black and
something.
white. It's not black
Yeah,
and
but
white.
it has to be something that it's clearly it's a God thing. Like because you know in Japan you can't carry a weapon.
Well, that's why I don't travel to Japan. I mean, the countries that I'm willing to travel to: Switzerland. Yeah, Switzerland. You can play with guns in Switzerland, and they're like, "Yeah, this is great."
Really, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, that took a weird turn, but I'm glad we had that discussion.
He was asking for
And
that.
yeah, you can text in all your questions. This will probably kind of create like a Second Amendment like controversy, but that's okay. Hey, love to hear from you. Text your questions in. Call. Go to pastorplek.com. We'd love to talk more about it. It's definitely one of those things where you can be a Christian on all sorts of the aisle on that one and have differences of opinion. That's great. We love that. So we'd love to hear from you. From our house to yours, have an awesome week of worship.